all the food being thrown away just because it ain't the right size or perfect, cause you can't turn a fast dollar that way. You know it ain't right to make people grow coffee when their families could be growing food. Working those lands for corporations don't do hungry people no good, cause people need food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. People got to have food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, and need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Don't you know it ain't right to cut the trees down just to grow a bunch of cheap hamburger meat? You know those trees, they hold the topsoil, and those burgers aren't fit to eat. And you know it ain't right to punish the farmers for growing food clean and poison free. There ought to be a government who protects them, protects dollars where they need to be, cause people need food in their belly, they need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. People got to have food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. But you know we spend 25 million on a movie, not even worth being shown on TV. We spend $2 billion on an airplane that we claim nobody else can see. Then we spend 800 billion on defenses, planning new ways to blow each other around. But even 1% of that budget could stop a whole lot of hungry sounds. People need food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Got to have food in their belly, they need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Kinda makes me wonder if we're gonna stay afloat.
Cliff has pursued a lifelong interest and personal study in issues of agriculture and food security. It is this devotion to the shaping of social policy through sound science that has attracted the NSF EPSCoR program's attention. Clifford has worked in agriculture for more than 25 years, primarily in insect management using naturally occurring microbial control agents. Many of his projects have been in collaboration with non-governmental organizations, allowing him to travel to over 20 countries. Most recently in the policy arena, Cliff testified to the Montana legislature regarding genetically modified wheat. Please welcome scientist and activist Clifford Bradley.
Well, thank you, Holly, and for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming on a pleasant summer evening. We don't get too many pleasant evenings in Missoula here, so it's good to Thank you for giving up one of them. Going to be talking about genetic engineering and hunger. That's been a topic that's shown up in the newspapers and a lot lately. And I wanted to talk about some of the connections there. And I think the first thing I want to do is explain a little bit about where this connection of agricultural technology and feeding the world comes from. In, I think it was late 2001, sort of October 2001, I went to a technical meeting in California of the California Association of Crop Protection Advisors. These are folks who do agricultural work, professional agricultural people in California. And the keynote speaker at this event was the chairperson of the Biotechnology Council. This is the lobby group of the big industrial ag companies that are doing the genetic engineering that everybody's talking about. And the gist of her talk in this keynote address went something like this, that the biotechnology industry really messed up in Europe. They did not present their case well, didn't reach consumers, and Europeans weren't buying into genetically modified crops. And she was promising that the Biotechnology Council would not make this same mistake in the United States. And so she described in great detail for an hour all of the market research the industry did on how to sell genetically modified crops to the American public. And she described, you know, the whole marketing thing, the focus groups and the surveys and questionnaires, and this went on for a long time. But the short story is the conclusion of this was that of all the issues that they could use to sell genetically modified crops to the American public, that Americans actually cared about world hunger and poverty, and so that's how they'd sell it. And that probably was the single most cynical speech I've heard in my life of agriculture. And but it set me to thinking, and it's you know, spending more time looking into this issue, and it's been a good you know, it served a purpose because it is getting some discussion of hunger in the world, and hopefully it will get some you know, discussion of some real alternatives and some real discussion of what the root causes are. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight. But, you know, and one example of this, of how this is being sold, right now in Sacramento as we speak, there's a ministerial conference and expo on agricultural science and technology. It's being sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the State Department. They invited 180 agricultural ministers from essentially every country in the world to come to this. If you're not invited, you don't get to go. So the people who want to discuss alternatives are currently being arrested in the streets of Sacramento, California. And it's basically to bring the executives of half a dozen big corporations together with the agricultural ministries of poor countries and tell them that they need genetically modified crops to feed themselves. And that's a whole conference that's being sponsored by taxpayer money here. But probably to give you a example of the absolute seamless connection between the companies that do genetically engineering of crops and the U.S. government, I would like to read a little quote from a speech that George Bush gave recently to the, of all people, the cadets at the Coast Guard Academy. But this is direct quotes from the speech, according to the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, the AP, I guess. Africa's long-term hunger could be greatly reduced by applying the latest developments of science, Bush said. By widening use of new high-yield biocrops and unleashing the power of markets, we can dramatically increase agricultural productivity and feed more people across the continent. Yet our partners in Europe are impeding this effort. They have blocked all new biocrops because of unfounded and unscientific fears. As a result, African nations have been reluctant to try growing genetically modified crops for fear their products will be shut out of European markets. I thought that's pretty interesting. The President of the United States has sort of encapsulated in one speech pretty much all of that side of the debate. The article goes on to talk about and announce the U.S. government initiative to, over 5 years, sponsor $15 billion, about $3 billion a year in AIDS relief in Africa for work in AIDS. What it doesn't say is the fine print of that, and what's things that really made me mad when I read it, was that the U.S. aid for AIDS in Africa is conditioned on African governments accepting genetically modified crops. And so you've got, basically the President of the United States promoting and using the power of his office to force these crops on the world, whether they like it or not. So we're going to talk some more about a bunch of these things tonight, but before I get going with that, I think I should make a little brief diversion from the discussion of hunger. The Europeans are not crazy. Neither are most molecular biologists who understand genetically modified crops and what's going on. And there are some grounds for real and serious concern here. So that this is not just the Europeans putting up some artificial trade barrier to protect their own farmers or whatever. There are real and legitimate concerns about genetically modified crops. I want to talk about that for a couple minutes here and as a bit of a grounding. I use a real sort of basic definition of genetic modification, which is that it's the human-mediated transfer of genetic information from between organisms that normally wouldn't exchange genetic information, which is sort of the essence of what a species is. So it's the human transfer of DNA, essentially, between species. And the kind of interesting to be having this debate now. In 1953, exactly 1 year ago, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins published the seminal paper in Nature, its 50th anniversary this year, that basically postulated the relationship between the structure and function of DNA in genetic maintenance of genetic information. So we've sort of understood a little bit about how genetics functions through the biochemistry of genetics for maybe 50 years or so. Life on the planet, on the other hand, has been evolving for something on the order of 2.5 or 3 billion years. The mechanisms whereby genetic information is stored, expressed in a cell to turn into the traits that we see in life, passed on to the next generation, and perhaps most importantly in life on Earth, how that information is segregated and that segregation is maintained between species. And a lot of molecular biologists, myself included, don't think we've really figured all of this stuff out, that 50 years hasn't been enough time for science to actually figure out everything there is to know about the maintenance of genetic and transmission of genetic information. So there's two specific areas that really worry people that are looking into, that study the risk of genetic engineering. There's a number of them. But there's two basic issues that really concern people. One is that when we do this genetic engineering, when we transfer a bit of DNA or a gene from one organism to another, we're not just transferring one gene or one piece of DNA. We transfer what's euphemistically called a genetic construct, which is actually several bits of DNA from different organisms all spliced together. And they may, and you need to do this for several reasons. One, like Roundup Ready wheat, which we'll talk about in a while, has a gene in it that makes wheat resistant to the herbicide Roundup. Roundup Ready crops, Roundup is the herbicide sold by Monsanto, and there's a piece of DNA that they got from a bacteria actually in the waste treatment pond at a Roundup factory that actually breaks down Roundup. So you put that gene in a plant and you spray Roundup on it, it breaks the molecule down, the plant doesn't die. But to get that bacterial gene into a wheat plant or a soybean plant, you have to attach it to whole bunches of other bits of DNA. You've got to have a piece of DNA typically from a tumor-causing bacteria to get the DNA into the cell, another piece of DNA typically from a plant virus, that causes a viral infection of plants, cauliflower mosaic virus. That's a piece of DNA that turns that gene on and off. You need another piece of DNA, which is typically an antibiotic resistance marker, so that you can find this thing when you've made it in the laboratory. And they splice all those together and shoot it into a plant with a gene gun, which literally is a gene gun. It's a little shotgun of tiny microscopic particles of gold coated with DNA, and you blast a cell culture with it. And some of it takes and most of it doesn't. And so it's a completely random sort of thing that you stick in the cell. So that's the number one thing. We're not transferring one gene. We're transferring genetic constructs of really multiple pieces of DNA to some unknown location in a cell. The second real big issue here is that we do not understand everything there is to know about how these bits of DNA are going to be regulated and expressed. The fundamental underlying assumption of all this is that one gene, one bit of DNA, will make one and only one protein. That this gene for Roundup resistance, that's the only thing it's going to do, is make Roundup resistant a protein that breaks down Roundup. It turns out that we've known for probably close to 20 years now, that scientists have known, that that's not the way the system really works. That there's actually many, many, many cases, including humans, soybeans, and pretty much everything we've genetically modified, where one bit of DNA will make any number of multiple proteins. And that there's all kinds of other mechanisms going on here where that bit of DNA may be expressed as different traits, may be expressed as multiple traits, or expressed as different proteins. And this is what worries people. This is where the unpredictability comes from. People are saying we can't predict the consequences of this, and this is why, because we don't understand how these genetic constructs are going to be regulated. And I could go on all night with examples of where this unpredictability has shown up in very unpredictable ways, but I'll use two. One is that this DNA is supposed to stay where it's put, right, in theory, but these virus promoters are very easily expressed in all kinds of different cells. That's why they use them. And British scientists have documented the transfer of genetic information, including antibiotic resistance, from Roundup-ready soybeans to bacteria in the human gut and bacteria in livestock. So, and antibiotic resistance is really one of the nastiest medical problems we've got. Pathogens, human diseases, becoming resistant to antibiotics. And we're spreading them around the world. There's now 80 million acres of antibiotic-resistant soybeans out there. Another example in soybeans is that there's a couple things that unpredictable happen with soybeans. One is that, you eat soybeans because the isoflavones, it's good for you. Well, the genetic events that made Roundup-ready soybeans seem to have reduced the production of isoflavones. Those aren't even the same genetic or biochemical pathways. They're completely different systems in the plant. Another thing that's going on in soybeans, they discovered this, actually Monsanto's being sued over this, in the southern United States. A couple summers ago, it got real hot, and all of the Roundup-ready soybeans, the stems shattered and the plants fell over. Not good for yield. And what happened is that they sorted this out, and what happened in the Roundup-ready soybeans, the same varieties where there's conventional soybeans, the Roundup-ready soybeans, these herbicide-tolerant plants, had more lignin in the stems. The stems are much more rigid, and so when it got hot and the sap expanded, it split the stems and they fell over. That didn't happen in northern crops, northern climate, where it was a little bit cooler, but when it was hot in the south, it happened. Those are major metabolic changes in soybean plants that have nothing to do with Roundup resistance, that one gene that was supposed to have been transferred, that apparently result from this whole thing. That's what are unpredictable effects that people are really worried about. And so that's why the Europeans don't like this. That's why the customers for Montana and U.S. wheat, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, don't want this stuff because they're concerned about this uncertainty. And if it was just a simple, if this was a chemical, this was a herbicide, you sprayed it out and you found out it was toxic, you could stop spraying it, you could take it back, it would go away, biodegrade. These are permanent genetic changes. This is life and it's self-replicating and it's out there, and once you do it, you can't take it back. Soybeans, genetically modified soybeans, have crossed with all kinds of other plants. We've got genetic modifications from corn in Iowa showing up in the land races of corn in Oaxaca, Mexico. So these changes are permanent and permanent part of the system, and we do not understand it. And that's one reason why this has become such an issue of trade. But that's kind of enough of a diversion. I should get back and, because this is about hunger, because that's how it's being sold to us. And the UN Food and Agriculture Organization every few years publishes a book a study, The State of Food Insecurity in the World. The most recent one was 2002. And this is the number one conclusion of this study, the 2002 and all the previous ones, is bears repeating. And if I sort of nothing else that you take away from the discussion tonight, is probably this: that hunger is not a result of shortages of food on the planet. Hunger is a result of poverty. And if, as I say, if you don't take anything else away from this, the next time you read the newspaper where they're talking about extolling the virtues of GMO crops, remember that it's not an issue of production, it's an issue of poverty. And according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, there's 840 million people in the world who don't have enough to eat, who have measurable levels of undernourishment. That's 1 in 7 people on the planet are suffering from calorie and protein malnutrition. Another 2 billion people, 1 in 3, suffer from micronutrient or mineral or vitamin deficiencies severe enough to impact their health. That's one out of every 3 people on the planet is not adequately nourished. And that's, and this is getting worse. This is not, in some countries, according to the UN, this is improving. I mean, China has actually made some pretty good strides in reducing hunger. Most of the world, and particularly in poor countries, the incidence of hunger is increasing. 50 years of industrial agriculture has not fed the world. And so that's one piece of the state of food security in the world, is that there's 1 in 7 people are malnourished. The second piece of this, which is alluded to but really not described in great detail by the UN reports, but that's in a lot of the globalization literature, certainly something I see when I travel in the third world, is that probably the principal consequence of the free market globalization that's been going on for the last, 20 years, certainly 10 years very intensively, 20 or 30 years of evolving policies. Probably the principal result of free market globalization is the absolute crushing of rural economies everywhere in the world. And it's universal. Montana, Malawi, Mexico, it doesn't, I've seen it. Say, as Holly said, I've worked in agriculture in probably 20 different countries, and you see the same thing everywhere. There's been the basic theory of free market globalization is that's been foisted on the world here by the economists. The theory of competitive advantage, that you're supposed to specialize in what you do well and do that, and get rid of unproductive agriculture, or if your advantage is growing wheat, you grow wheat and import your food. If your advantage is cheap labor, you have sweatshops and sell blue jeans, and then you'll be able to buy your food from somebody else. Well, that system isn't working, and that's the principal reason there's hunger in the world. Is that of those 840 million hungry people, most of them, 60-some-odd%, about 2/3, actually live in rural areas, and most of those people live in rural areas of countries that export food. The UN's figure for hungry children is that 78% of hungry kids live in countries that export food. So the system of comparative advantages really isn't working. It does, and again, it's the same thing in Montana. I mean, Montana, in the mid-'80s, early '90s, probably peaking, I think, in 1996, Montana made roughly 700 to, I think the peak in 1996 was about $850 million in direct income from selling wheat. 2001, we made $336 million. Montana's income from wheat is half of what it used to be. And that's because Montana, like every place else, is suffering from a 30-year decline in the real price of agricultural commodities. The world does not value agriculture. That the price of wheat has been $3.50 for 40 years. And that's not inflation adjusted, that's real. I mean, it goes up, one year it'll be $4, the next year it'll be $2.75, but the average price of wheat hasn't really changed. Input costs have changed. There used to be 20,000 farmers in Montana, now there's 7,000. But this is going on all over the world. Just a couple of examples. Some of us in Community Action for Justice in the Americas have been working on chocolate, cacao production. In the late 70s and early 80s, cacao, which is the major export of a lot of equatorial Africa, particularly the Ivory Coast, was more than $3,000 a ton. This is what you make chocolate out of, right? That was selling for $3,000 a ton. At $3,000 a ton, the money that actually made it back to a farmer in the Ivory Coast or Colombia or somewhere actually probably bought a living. The price has been less than $1,000 for most of the late 90s and 2000. It's been up a little bit since they've been having a war on the Ivory Coast, but farmers aren't making a living anymore. Another, coffee. Coffee is actually the most widely traded agricultural commodity in the world. And coffee farmers are not making a living. In the late 80s, the World Bank did a huge big project to help countries in Southeast Asia pay off their debts. We'll talk some more about debt in a minute, and put them into intensive coffee farming. So there's a huge new coffee farming going on in Southeast Asia, created an enormous glut of coffee in the world, and the prices have collapsed. It takes in Central America, I did a lot of work in coffee in Colombia, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Central America takes about $1.20 to grow a pound and harvest and deliver a pound of coffee to the port of export. And this is good high-class Central American coffee. This is what you pay $8 to $10 for at Starbucks or the Good Food Store or something. In mid-2002, the 2002 harvest of coffee, the price at the port of export in Nicaragua was 20 cents a pound. And there's no way that, they didn't even harvest the crop. And that's the principal form of rural employment in Central America, is the harvesting and processing of coffee. There's people literally starving to death in the streets of Managua because there is no seasonal employment in coffee because they can't afford to pick it. So this, you can pick a commodity, tomatoes in Mexico, nectarines in Chile. This is going on in rural economies all over the world. And so it's just, the basic system here is not working. And one of the principal reasons it's not working is that despite George Bush's protestations to the contrary, the free market that everybody's talking about in agriculture does not exist. And there's two levels where that doesn't exist. One is the world trading system. The agricultural system is not a level playing field. And if the World Trade Organization comes apart, it will be because of the third world rebelling against the unfair ag rules. Everybody else in the developing world is supposed to have a free market in agriculture, except for the U.S., where we spend $26 billion a year in propping up farm prices. That's not allowed anywhere else in the world. In poor countries. Europe and the U.S. subsidize farmers, but if you want to trade with us, you can't subsidize your farmers. And this is starting to upset the rest of the world pretty seriously. Lost my place here. Hang on a second. So what? My glasses on, then I can see this. This is good. Okay. Well, I've seen, there's lots of facts and figures about this. That, you can read UN reports all day long and read all this stuff, but it sticks with you when you see it. I've been in rural areas where see hungry kids. Obvious, serious, probably clinical malnutrition. Their hair turns white from protein malnutrition. Their stomachs are distended, and this is in places that Nicaragua or Guatemala or West Africa, and down the street in most of these places there's a market that's just bursting with food. And I can't imagine being a mother, knowing your kids are slowly starving, knowing there's food down the street and not being able to buy it. And that's what characterizes hunger in the world. Most people who are hungry, who have malnourished themselves or malnourished kids, live surrounded in rural areas, surrounded by food, and they don't have the money to buy it. because the only thing that really pays less than working in a sweatshop in a developing country is working in agriculture. Working as a day labor, seasonal labor in farms does not pay enough to buy food and clothing and shelter and medical care. It just isn't. The minimum wage in Mexico is about $3.50 a day. A coffee picker in Guatemala or Costa Rica or Nicaragua makes less than $2 a day, and that's hard work, and it's not enough to live on. And that's the principal reason people are hungry, is they do not have the money to buy food. And the other principal cause of hunger is that because they can't buy food, those markets, the local markets that are bursting with food, I mean, quite literally, I mean, you can walk into a market anywhere in West Africa or Nicaragua or Colombia or somewhere, and it's literally bursting with food. I mean, there's 40 different kinds of fruits and vegetables in most of these places because it's the tropics, and you can grow all kinds of stuff. And the principal problem of rural economies is that the farmers who grow that food can't make a living because nobody has the money to buy it. So where we are now in the state of the world's agriculture is we live in a world with 840 million hungry people and a rural economy where farmers can't make a living, and the system is not working. But that brings us to genetically modified crops, a sort of agro-industrial government complex, with apologies to Dwight Eisenhower there, but that's the only way I can think about the influence that the big agrochemical companies have on the U.S. government. This conference in Sacramento is being convened by Ann Veneman, the Secretary of Agriculture. Before she became Secretary of Agriculture, she was corporate counsel for Monsanto. The Secretary of Commerce, and this is completely bipartisan, the Secretary of Commerce under Clinton was a guy named Mickey Cantor. He's currently chairman of the board of Monsanto. Monsanto actually has access to this government that even oil companies are envious of. And it's unbelievable. But somehow the sort of ideas being promulgated in the popular press and at conferences like this, that somehow the sort of neo-Luddites at Greenpeace and or Vandana Shiva or whoever the radical of the moment is, that somehow these people are preventing the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the U.S. government, the Department of Agriculture, and a half a dozen corporations with sales north of $50 billion, that somehow Greenpeace is stopping these people from feeding the world. Well, I don't think so. You know, I mean, these are the people that created this system. We've been evolving for this system for the last 50 years. If you heard Josh Lotnick last week, he talked about genetic modification of crops as sort of a red herring in the debate over industrial agriculture. And in some ways it is. I mean, genetically modified crops are sort of the ultimate extension of 50 years of very clear and deliberate policies to industrialize agriculture in the world. And that's, you know, it's not a whole lot different in policy. It certainly is in biology, but in policy it's not a whole lot different than many of the other sort of advances we've made in agriculture that have resulted in a ever diminishing ability of farmers to make a living. And there's several points of probably where genetically modified crops, or this, and in particular, and this sort of the model of the economic and agricultural policy models that we've pursued for the last 50 years really end up creating hunger. I mean, this just didn't happen. And that's kind of the theme of this talk is technology that creates hunger. We tend to view in the United States technology as sort of the answer to everything, that there's a techno fix and you'll be okay. But hunger is a social and economic problem. It has nothing to do with technology or food supply. And it's the interconnection between sort of social, political, and economic policy and these technologies where hunger really gets created. And I alluded a little bit earlier to the corporate, you know, that the degree of control of corporations and the lack of free markets here. But that's really one of the big issues is control as one annual report of one of the big European ag chemical companies, which used to be Ciba-Geigy, which is one then Ciba, which is now Syngenta, was profiting from seed to table. And this is in the annual reports. I mean, you know, this is a strategy here. And this control is a big issue, and where genetic engineering is a major piece. And to understand this, I think it helped to, there's a project, actually, the Catholic Church, Catholic Rural Life, the Jesuits, and people looking at the agroeconomic system in the U.S., in particular the world in general. And they've really described the way the system works in a very elegant way that I think helps understand. They describe it as two choke points. They sort of think about the world food system as two funnels laying on their side. And starting at the input end, you've got one choke point, which is the inputs to agriculture. The genetic engineering and almost all new agrochemicals, pesticides, herbicides, all that is brought to us by 5 companies. 5 companies in the entire planet control most of the seed and certainly all the genetic research, almost all of the chemicals, and a good deal of the seed inputs to agriculture. There's about 10 companies that actually control most of the agricultural seed, commercial seed. This is why the rest of the world, the developing world, is really upset over issues of intellectual property and saving seeds, is they need to keep themselves, their farmers are trying to keep out of this system and save their seed so that they can replant the same seed, while you've got the corporations on the other side genetically modifying it and patenting it so that you have to buy it from the company year after year. This is a major debate in the World Trade Organization over what's euphemistically called trade-related intellectual property rights, TRIPS. But it's a huge issue. So you got this choke point of no more than 24 companies, half a dozen very large ones at one end. They got a whole bunch of farmers in the middle. And the next choke point is between all those farmers are funneled down to the distribution system. And this is where we keep talking about the markets, and we wonder why coffee is 20 cents a pound and who profits from that, or why cacao is $800 a ton and who profits from that, or why wheat's $3.50 a bushel perennially. And that's because of that second choke point. 3 companies control 80% of the world's trade in grain and oilseeds. ConAgra, Archer Daniel Midlands, and Cargill. 2 of them are privately traded. You can't even get an annual report from 2 of the 3 companies that control 80% of the world's grain trade. Montana doesn't have customers. We get to sell all our wheat to ConAgra. That's pretty much it. We sell a little bit directly to a Japanese importer, but that's 4 companies control the world's trade in coffee. There's a coffee futures market, but it's very hard to get past Nestle and Procter & Gamble here. The same thing in chocolate, cacao. I mean, there's 3 companies that control 80% of the world trade in cacao. So there's free market that we keep talking about does not exist in agriculture. And that issue of control is really why, controlling prices, controlling inputs is what's impoverishing farmers. And again, it doesn't make any difference whether you're a farmer in Shelby or a farmer in Mexico. It's working pretty much the same. A second way that genetically modified crops and the ag system in general is creating hunger is it's not sustainable. Every once in a while, there is a severe and major failure in the system. We see this reported as famine. Generally, famine, particularly in Africa, is just a sort of bumping of chronic hunger into an acute crisis. But the system is not sustainable in any way. I mean, one of the principal functions of genetically modified crops is to take diversity out of the agricultural system. And so you end up with American corn being eaten in Africa, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. But this is not sustainable in a number of different levels. One is it's as a just agronomic system. I mean, we've had genetically modified soybeans, Roundup herbicide-resistant soybeans, commercially available in the United States for about 7 years, maybe 5 years where it's been planted in major levels, about 2/3 of the U.S. soybean crop now. And the weeds are already resistant. You know, you got Roundup Ready soybeans, so you spray Roundup year after year. You used to have to use 2 or 3 herbicides to control the weeds in soybeans. With Roundup Ready, you know, the advantage for farmers, they spray once or twice instead of 2 or 3 times. So it saves a pass over the field, which is why they buy it. It saves a little bit on a bushel of soybeans or a bushel of wheat. But the weeds, you know, so that you overuse Roundup, which is why Monsanto did this to begin with, was to sell more Roundup, not to feed the world. But you overuse it, and the weeds are resistant. So I've got an ad from a competing herbicide company that says, you know, buy our herbicide, spray before your crop comes up, what's called pre-emergence sprays of herbicide, so that you can manage resistance to Roundup. Well, now you're spraying 2 or 3 times because your weeds are resistant to Roundup, and so you haven't gained anything. And that's what they want to bring to Montana. I mean, that's what Roundup Ready wheat, that's going to be the debate in Montana, is that a farmer can save, the economic models say, a farmer can save 5 or 10 cents a bushel in the production cost of wheat by planting Roundup, because you only have to make 1 pass instead of 2 passes to control your weeds until the weeds get resistant. In the meantime, the other economic models say that when the Japanese and the Koreans and the Saudis and everybody else stop buying Montana wheat, that the price of wheat will go down by between 50 cents and $1 a bushel. So saving a nickel and losing $1 is not really the way to develop Montana's rural economy. The estimates are that that would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of a minimum at 50 cents a bushel loss in wheat price. That would cost Montana farmers $87 million a year in direct lost income. And that's a huge impact multiplied in the economy. Right now in Montana, 1/2 on average of all crop income in the state of Montana is government payments. Nobody's making any money growing wheat now. And if you shave $1 a bushel off the price you receive, at some point the taxpayers of the United States may get tired of propping up rural Montana or rural Kansas, and we're done for. I mean, this is a serious issue. So it's not sustainable in agronomic practice, or in markets for that matter, and the loss of diversity, it's not sustainable in feeding the world. One of the principal effects of the Green Revolution was to produce huge quantities of cereals at the expense of everything else. Since the Green Revolution, India has become the #2 wheat producing country in the world. They're ahead of the United States. India produces more wheat than the U.S. They also have the world's highest incidence of protein malnutrition. And it's because they've replaced a diverse diet with wheat. Because if you raise lentils for a living, you can't make a living growing lentils anymore. So vegetable-based protein has disappeared from Indian diets, replaced by large-scale monocultures of wheat. And so there's enough calories in India, but there is not enough protein, and there's not enough vitamin A, and there's not enough diversity in the system. Probably a couple other examples here of how, I want to run out of time here, how the sort of continuation of this system with genetically modified crops continues to impoverish rural parts of the world and directly creates hunger. I mean, there's all kinds of examples here, but I'll use some from some places I've been. Mexico supplies 2/3 of the fresh packed tomatoes in the United States, more than half the cucumbers. Mexico feeds a good part of the world, and I've been traveling in Mexico since 1995. NAFTA went into effect in 1996. And since NAFTA went into effect, Mexico has undergone probably one of the most profound economic and social transformations in history, certainly modern history. Since 1996, 10% of the Mexican population has just been displaced from employment in rural areas. 1 million Mexicans have lost land ownership, direct loss of farms, and that's taken 10 million people out of rural Mexico. That's 10% of the population. And the principal reason is because we've dumped a vast quantity of genetically modified corn on them. What happened here with corn and what's going to Mexico and what's going to happen with wheat in India when we genetically modify it is the rest of the world is going to quit buying it. In 1995, the United States exported $400 million worth of corn to Europe. In 1999, it was less than 1 million. The Europeans just quit buying corn from us, okay? So that's a couple 100 million bushels of corn, and it didn't go just anywhere. We had to go, Cargill and Archer Daniel Midlands had to do something with all that corn. We make a lot of sweeteners and stuff out of it. But the main thing we did with it was dumped it on Mexico. Under NAFTA rules, Mexico dropped their subsidies and their tariffs and any protection they had for Mexican corn farmers. So now you've got the price, of course, when Europe quit buying American corn, the price fell out of the bottom of corn. I mean, we had for corn in 2001 was less than $2 a bushel. And the production cost of corn is probably, on average, maybe $3.25 a bushel, $3 a bushel. 40% of all farm income in the Midwestern United States is government payments. And so now you've got a situation where Archer Daniel Midlands or Cargill has 200 million bushels, or give or take, of $2 corn, and they dump it on Mexico, which has roughly the same corn production cost that we do, about $3, maybe a little more. And the Mexicans are producing tortilla corn. We're producing cattle and hog feed, and it just blew the bottom out of the price of corn in Mexico. Farmers in Mexico without subsidies can't compete, and they're going. I spent a whole evening drinking beer with a Mexican agricultural economist from the University of Chihuahua one evening, and he and some colleagues have published a paper that basically estimates the loss of Mexican farmers over the last 3 years at 600 a day, losing land ownership that just cannot compete with this flood of American corn. There's another guy, a professor at Berkeley. He's a Chilean guy named Miguel Altieri. He's quite an interesting guy. He and some colleagues did a study in Argentina that looked at correlations of land ownership patterns in Argentina with introduction of genetically modified Roundup-ready soybeans. And there's you can go into the statistics, but the statistics are pretty ironclad that the principal effect of genetically modified soybeans in Argentina hasn't been to increase soybean production or hasn't been increased yields. It's been to concentrate land ownership. That Argentina has lost 27,000 farmers a year with the introduction of genetically modified soybeans. And Argentina also got in serious hot water with the International Monetary Fund, a major collapse in their economy. So when you lose your farm in Argentina, there's nothing else to do. I mean, this is a couple hundred, maybe 300,000 people a year in Argentina who can no longer make a living on the land and have no place to go. And the reason is because if you're a farmer and had enough mechanization to be using herbicides and you could save that pass over your soybean field, you could now spray more soybeans with one tractor and buy out your neighbor. And maybe that's good for that farmer who survives, but as a way to develop a rural economy, it doesn't work very well. Probably a couple of the last examples here, the President Bush and everybody were talking about Africa, and one of the real thing that's been in the news a lot in the last little while is African governments refusing U.S. food aid, refusing to accept U.S. corn, particularly Zambia. And that this is what President Bush is talking about, that the nasty old Europeans are, causing hunger in Africa. And the sort of proximate, the reason that's in the press about this is that this is southeastern Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, parts of North Africa, Botswana. That area in southeastern Africa has been suffering from a pretty severe famine and drought for the last few years. And widespread starvation. I mean, people were literally starving to death in these countries. Defined as a famine. What actually happened was Zambia is a good example. In 1996, there were roughly 69% of the population of Zambia living under Zambia's poverty level, which is not a real livable wage. In 2001, that was up to 86%. So 86% of the population of Zambia lives below Zambia's official poverty line. Many of these countries define acute poverty not in terms of money, but in terms of access to calories. That the UN establishes acute poverty as less than 1,500 calories a day. So we're not even talking about whether you make $1 a day. We're talking about whether you have access to enough calories to live. And so what happens when you have a drought is it sort of, bumps over that chronic hunger into acute food shortages where people starve to death in a short-term period of time instead of a long-term period of time. But at the same time, and one of the main issues that's been debated here is that while all this is going on, of course, Zambia and Malawi and these countries are growing corn to export to Europe. This is, countries that export food where people are starving. And they didn't want U.S. genetically modified corn. One reason was because if it will contaminate the seed stock, contaminate the food supply, and the Europeans will quit buying corn, and that'll be the end of any foreign exchange they've got in Zambia. So one thing they did was say, and Zimbabwe and a couple other countries finally agreed to take U.S. corn if the U.S. would grind it up first so it couldn't be planted. And we fought that. Our government refused to do that for 6 months before they finally agreed to grind up the corn so it couldn't be planted. But Zambia still refused, and the reason that they did is not been reported widely in the papers or in the news, but there's a good website, Food First, usually keeps track of this stuff. The real reason Zambia refused corn aid is because what they said is what we really need is not to be dumped on with surplus U.S. crops. We need the capital to buy corn from places, other countries in Africa that produce corn, and so when they have a famine, they could buy corn from us in a good year. So that they're seeing the solution to this as not U.S. foreign aid as basically a prop for Midwestern U.S. agriculture and a sink for excess U.S. crops, but needing foreign aid in acute crisis that supports their farmers rather than puts their agriculture out of business. And that's the real reason they refused the aid. Another connection here, Malawi, give an example of how this worked. Malawi got in a big middle of this debate. But one of the things that happened to Malawi, I don't know if Malawi is another little country down there, and I've spent some time in Malawi, interesting place. But Malawi is one of those governments, most African governments have kept corn reserves or grain reserves that they buy from their own farmers over the good times and use it in bad times, and it's a way to support their agriculture. Well, this doesn't fit with the structural adjustment programs and the free market economic models of the International Monetary Fund and assorted institutions. And as conditions for further loans, Malawi was ordered by the IMF to sell their corn reserves. And they sold their corn reserves in 2001. They sold them down for 160 million metric tons to about 30 million. And within a year, people were starving to death. I mean, this is the connection of free market theory and globalization with hunger. And so these, I could use more examples, but I run out of time. But I want to kind of conclude with some discussions and what people are really talking about as solutions to hunger. And none of them have to do with genetically modified crops. But I want to read another little piece here from, that probably think back to what I read from George Bush earlier in the talk here, and contrast this with what 24 delegates from 18 African countries were talking about at the UN Food and Agricultural Organization conference in 1999. And it's a quote from the statement from these 18 African countries. We strongly object that the image of the poor and hungry from our countries is being used by giant multinational corporations to push a technology that is neither safe, environmentally friendly, nor economically beneficial to us. We do not believe that such companies or gene technologies will help our farmers. On the contrary, we think it will destroy the diversity, the local knowledge, and the sustainable agricultural systems that our farmers have developed for millennia, and that it will thus undermine our capacity to feed ourselves. So there you got George Bush's vision of the world, which is, technology and America feeding the world, and an African vision of how Africa could feed itself. And that's where the solutions lie. These are not technological solutions. These are social, economic, and political solutions to hunger. It's a social and economic problem, and political issue, and that's where the solutions will lie. Roughly 6 out of 10 people in the world live in rural areas and have some connection to agriculture. And these are the people that actually feed the poor now, and these are the people that need help. We don't need, and they're not the people that need genetically modified crops. They need customers with money. In my work in agriculture, I spent most of my time working with pest management problems on large industrial export agriculture projects, because that's where the bug problems are. It's where the weed problems are. Small farmers have these problems, but not nearly to the extent that large-scale monocultures do. And so what these people need is not industrial technology. They need support in knowledge-based agriculture. They need to keep the diversity in their systems, and that will make them sustainable. They need land reform. I mean, this has been talked about for 50 years, ever since, probably before 50 years, but acutely for the last 50 years. What most of the revolutions in the world have been about, ultimately, is land reform. And you can look at facts and figures of who owns what kind of land or how much land in different countries, but you also have to look at what the quality of it is. You go to countries that export food, which is most poor countries, and the big corporate export farms own the good land. The people who grow for local markets are living on hillsides or have no irrigation or have marginal soils. The people with capital who are growing for export have flat ground, deep soils, and water. And the people that are feeding the world are feeding them hanging on hillsides, basically, or bad land of one sort or another, poor soils, lack of irrigation. And if they had access to good land, they could produce, that's what they need to produce more food, is having people who produce food for local markets have access to decent farm ground. And it's not a mystery once you go wander around in West Africa or Nicaragua or whatever. You can see it there. We need to have, along with land reform, some alternative ownership structures and alternative ways for people to make money in agriculture. This may be cooperatives, and it may be fair trade. I mean, fair trade coffee, for example, at least pays a farmer $1.26 now, I think, for a pound of coffee, which you can make a living on. I mean, you're not going to get rich, but you can feed your kids and send them to school and have a house, which isn't too much to ask for some pretty serious hard work growing coffee. And so there's a number of reforms like that are within, certainly within our grasp. And I've seen examples of these where, I've seen some really nasty examples of bad agriculture. I've also seen some really good ones. And the really good ones combine sustainable practice with social and economic structures that make sense for the people that are there, make sense within local economies. And that's what works. The most beautiful farm I have ever seen in my life is in Nicaragua, in a place where they used to grow cotton and totaled the ground with insecticides. And these people went in as a cooperative and reclaimed this ground with sustainable agricultural practices in a cooperative structure, grow mixed cropping systems where you plant local varieties that work with local conditions. They grow some crops for export. They grow tomatoes and sweet onions for export. They grow corn and beans for their own use in local markets. And their yields are every bit as good as industrial farms, and their input costs are lower. It's the most profitable farm in Nicaragua. And finally, the last thing we need to do to enable countries to feed themselves is cancel their debts. the most staggering economic problem of the places where people are starving is their governments are in debt. The largest single government expenditure for the impoverished countries of the world is debt service. Zambia pays 4 times more in debt service than they do for health care when 86% of their people are hungry. And it makes no sense at all. And this is something that we could talk about forever, but that's an essential part of the solution is that, you know, we talk about food aid for Africa. For every dollar in food aid or any total foreign aid, for every dollar in total foreign aid in Africa, they pay $1.31 in debt service to international banks and financial institutions. They will never catch up and they will never pay it back. They need to have it canceled. This is stuff that's left over from the 1970s. It's been paid many times over, and it's dragging these economies into the ground. And that is a political decision that can be made in this country, in the United States Senate, basically. And so hunger, ultimately, the hunger and the solutions, the hunger exists in the third world, in the developed, what we call the global south now, and the solutions primarily exist in the halls of Congress. And with that, I'll think I've hit my 50 minutes and we'll stop. Thank you. And I will entertain questions for as long as people want to ask, I guess. Yeah.
Is genetically modified food marked for the consumer? And then secondly, being from the 60s, the population bomb, I remember when that book came out, told us that we were going to have incredible problems, especially in third world countries, because of overpopulation. Does that fit into this concern also?
Well, the question was, well, 2 questions. One is genetically modified food labeled? Can consumers know about it? And second is what, if I can paraphrase this, population pressures how they relate to this issue of hunger. The first, there's a 2-part answer to your first question, that genetically modified crops are not labeled in the United States. And it's one of the really amazing things. I mean, here I am, you know, probably being regarded as some socialist or something, but, you know, if the free market and consumer choice had anything at all to do with genetically modified crops, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. I mean, you know, nobody wants to buy this stuff. And genetically modified crops are the only industry I can think of where the companies that do it spend tens of millions of dollars to prevent you from knowing about it. This is reverse advertising to the extreme. The United States does not require in any way any labeling of genetically modified crops, except for Vermont. Vermont just recently passed a law that requires genetic labeling. Oregon tried to, and it was they spent $5 or $6 million to defeat the ballot measure in Oregon. European countries label it, Japan labels it, and that's why they don't buy it. And that's why, you know, I mean, the United States has now taken the European Union to the World Trade Organization in a tribunal to demand that they buy, you know, that it's an unfair restraint of trade to have a moratorium on genetically modified crops. And, you know, we may win the United States. Incidentally, that suit is being led by, or the political impetus for that is Senator Grassley from Iowa and Senator Baucus from Montana on the Senate Finance Committee. But the outcome of that is the Europeans aren't going to buy it anyway, and the companies know that. I mean, it's you know, we won a trade thing over hormones in beef. We successfully took Europe to the World Trade Organization, and they lifted their moratorium on U.S. hormone-treated beef, but still nobody buys it. I mean, our exports of beef to Europe are still essentially zero. So the labeling has been an important issue and a survival one for the companies. The second one of the population issue is certainly important in some areas, some countries, but it's not a correlation with hunger. I mean, there's countries that are, you know, Bangladesh, which probably has the highest population density in the world, doesn't have any more hunger as a percentage of their population than the Uruguay or some other places that are much less densely populated. So there's no real, the correlations are more political and economic than they are population. And sort of the macro number is that there's more than enough food to feed everybody in the world. I mean, in terms of calories, there's no shortage of food. So at some point, I think we're going to hit other agriculturally related resource issues before an absolute supply issue. Water be one. Phosphorus for fertilizer may be one. So we're going to hit resource issues before we hit population issues, I think, from what I see.
In some of the southeastern African countries that you spoke about, who controls the water?
Water is an immensely complicated issue of globalization now. I mean, there's been a major move to privatize water, starting with primarily municipal domestic water supply. And I don't know, it varies a lot from country to country, but a lot of what used to be public water projects are being privatized. And as part of the whole structural adjustment program you're supposed to do to be able to pay off your debts and join the free market, you have to privatize your utilities. And in some countries that's included agricultural water, and most countries it hasn't yet. One of the other thing though is that a number of multinational companies, Monsanto included, are buying up agricultural water rights around the world where they can. So it's getting to be a really important issue, but I can't give you a specific example for southeastern Africa.
Would you go back to the GMO issue? It's been something like 7 years now since they first started this, actually releasing it in corn or soybeans or whatever. Once modified, do you see that the GMO modifications don't hold to the boundaries of, say, corn or soybeans? They're being, moving up the food chain, and how extensive is, that at this time?
What Rick is asking is to go back to some of the issues of the genetics of this, and if I can paraphrase, to these genes, are they transferring from genetically modified crops since they've been introduced to other crops? Is that a fair paraphrase?
Or even up the food chain?
Or up the food chain. Yeah, I mean, we've had genetically modified crops in commercial use in the United States basically for 7 or 8 years. Corn and soybeans were first, and cotton, and then canola. And there's really only 3 or 4 countries in the world that actually do this. I mean, the United States is by far and away more genetically modified crops than any other. Canada has a lot of canola, Argentina soybeans, and China some cotton. I mean, this is not a sort of worldwide phenomenon yet, but the United States has had genetically modified soy and corn now for about 7, 8 years commercially. And it's everywhere. I mean, and this is one of the real worries that people have as we do more genetically modification of things, especially for medical reasons. The genes move out of these plants in, genetically modified corn contaminates non-genetically modified corn, a huge issue for organic growers. There's no organic canola left truly in the United States because it's all, the seed stock is pretty much permanently contaminated because these are open pollinated plants, so they exchange pollen, and pretty soon canola pollen will travel for miles, corn pollen will travel for miles. Wheat self-pollinating, so it's not quite such a big issue. But so the first thing we've done is contaminate large amounts of non-genetically modified crops of the same variety. This has occurred over wide distances. I mentioned earlier, I mean, they're in Mexico, there is genetically modified bits of DNA from Iowa corn in southern Mexico in the ancient land races of corn. That's basically the genetic reservoir for corn in the world, which is corn evolved in southern Mexico and is contaminated. There's little bits of bacterial DNA from BT corn living in the land races of corn in Mexico. And I spent quite a while at a conference listening to a debate about how wide the buffer zone should be around corn, whether it should be a mile or half a mile, or 2,000 miles is a little bit short. So, and it's because we dumped corn. Some Mexican farmers save some seed and plant it the next year. They cross-pollinate with the local varieties. So this does not stay put. And whether it goes up and down the food chain certainly goes various directions in the food chain, particularly transfers of genetic material, like I mentioned, genetic material to bacteria, naturally occurring bacteria. There are examples where genetically modified soybeans have crossed with closely related weeds, plant species, and now you've got Roundup-resistant weeds, which is not a real, advance in life. So they really don't stay put. And this is, there's a whole other thing that we haven't even talked about, which is coming, which is the genetic modification of plants for medical purposes. This is to produce proteins of therapeutic value or whatever. And there's some real, probably the companies that do this several of them have been sued. Nobody's managed to control this yet, but they all promise they can. To give you an idea of how far this has gone, of how far we're willing to go on how little we understand about the genetic structures of what we're dealing with, there's a company in San Diego called Epicite, and they have genetically modified corn to produce a human spermicide. Okay, this is an antibody. It's a protein that binds to sperm. So now you basically have a biochemical condom, and would be used as a vaginal product to prevent pregnancy. They've engineered this in corn. Okay, so now you have a human spermicide engineered into an open pollinated plant that's the second most widely consumed crop on the planet. Some people don't think this makes a lot of sense. And they have promised that they've got a 2-mile buffer zone around these fields. Well, we're still about 9,980 miles short of the buffer we probably need. And this is going on, we've got swine and pig vaccines being produced in corn. We've got tobacco plants being engineered with human pharmaceuticals, and there's essentially almost no regulation of this. I mean, they've got permits to put this in field trials, and it's nuts. And it's not solving, if somebody was genetically altering a plant that would solve malaria, we could talk about it. But to have one more birth control device, it may not be worth it. So the worry about these things moving around in the biosphere is real, very real, and it's happening. Yeah.
I have a question. Say that hunger is not an issue of production, it's an issue of poverty. And part of the problem is that small rural farmers, their cost of production can't meet the market cost, correct?
Yeah.
And so, I guess my question to you is, would you support the use of genetically modified crops that help reduce like drought-resistant plants and pest-resistant plants that help grow for them? So things that help offset this cost, so we can bring back rural farmers. And there are different institutions that help fund small rural farming and things like this, so they get to help offset the company costs of that. So would you support instances like that of using genetically modified plants?
No, I mean that technology fix is not where the answers lie. I mean, farmers can't make enough money, get paid enough for their crops, can't get paid the production cost for their crop because their market has been flooded with, say, cheap U.S. subsidized feed corn. Okay, so you can't get paid a real price for the corn you grow because the local markets are flooded with $2 subsidized American corn. If you had a level playing field, they might have a chance. And if you want, drought resistance, they need irrigation. I mean, that's not a technological mystery that most small farmers on small landholding producing for local markets the capital and economic development that's been supplied that put most of these countries in debt did not go to irrigation projects for farmers that grew for local markets. They went to irrigation projects for export crops. So you can go to, I spent years working in Guatemala in melon fields where there was 9,000, well, what, 3,000, about 9,000 acres of cantaloupe production in the best farmland in Nicaragua and in Guatemala. It's flat, irrigated, topsoil was probably 4 feet deep, nice volcanic. It was great ground. Drip irrigation systems, and all that capital was USAID supplied capital to help Del Monte, Dole, and a company called Central America Produce develop that land for melon production for export to the U.S. Go 5 miles from there, there's people hanging on. I mean, you could see the farms on the hillside above there, hanging on the hillsides. In a good year where it rained, they had a crop. In a bad year where it didn't rain, they didn't. And so a drought-resistant crop might help them. You know, a couple hectares of irrigated ground in the valley would help them a lot more. And though, you know, until we deal with those social and political issues, we don't, you know, technology is not an answer until we deal, for me anyway, until we deal with those social and political issues. You know, that's, you know, and that's what the companies are selling us. That, you know, if you know, if you had a pest-resistant, you know, BT corn is engineered with a bacterium that a toxin produced by a bacterium that kills insects, kills caterpillars in particular. So you can engineer the plant to produce this protein. A caterpillar munches on the leaf and it dies. So, you know, that may or may not cut pesticide costs. But even if, assuming it did, that's not, you know, that farmer may, you know, cut his cost by a nickel, but if it quits raining for 1 year, he's going to lose his crop anyway. So those, you know, it's not, those sort of techno fixes aren't going to solve the problem, at least any ag system I've looked at. And I'm probably not giving you a very satisfactory answer in 5 minutes here, but I could talk all night about that. But it's the short answer is no, I don't see it. That's not going to be the solution.
Some of NPR are brought to you by Archer Granule Mineral.
Yeah. They supermarket to the world, I think, is the phrase. Yeah. Steve.
Yeah, great talk. I wanted to put this in another historical context, and I know you've been talking for a long time about this, but could you address the issue of, since agriculture came about 10,000 years ago, we landed in one spot to work the land. And working the land with all the vagaries of climate and drought and everything else created a sense of
I'm not quite sure how to paraphrase that question for the radio audience. In a historical context of human evolution or human movement from hunting-gathering to through stable agriculture, crop production one place, to the Industrial Revolution and where we are now, what choices or what room do we have for choice, social choices in the decisions of how we evolve that? We used to have a lot more than we do now, and I think that's one of the big issues of globalization, is that those choices are being lost. That in the sort of imposition of free market ideology on the world, competitive advantage and all these theories, that one result of that imposition of those policies is the loss of that choice. And particularly the loss of the choice if you want to stay on the land. And that you can't, that the system has evolved to where local, and it's not, I mean, evolve is not the right word. The system has been directly subsidized as a function of government policy in rich countries to concentrate that production, to create those labor pools, and take away that choice, I think. And again, you can see it, the sort of manifestations of that probably in Montana as well as any place else. The last time I looked, for example, 90%, give or take, of the beef consumed in Montana is imported. So we don't, even in the U.S., let alone the developing world, particularly in the U.S., I guess, where these policies have been promoted, we have taken diversity out of the system. We have actively rewarded industrialization at the expense of small farms and diversity. The Farm Bill, that every 5 years the U.S. passes an ever more massive farm bill to prop up agriculture, and that always functions to reward large at the expense of large and, I say, inefficient at the expense of small and diverse. And that's not been an accidental policy by any means. So and you look at my experience, probably more in Central America, Nicaragua in particular, some in Mexico certainly. In Nicaragua, I mean, it's the delivered policy to just say that Nicaragua can't compete in agricultural production, so we'll subsidize sweatshops. And that what Nicaragua's competitive advantage in the world economy is cheap labor. And that its labor is cheaper than Mexican labor, so that's where everybody will go. That's how you're going to develop your economy, by being a bit less, paying your labor less than your neighbors. And that's been one of the major, that's very explicit development policy of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. I mean, it's not, and the institutions that finance development. So, in a large sense, I think it takes away those choices. If you can't farm, you're going to become you're lucky if you get a job in a sweatshop because it pays a little more than picking coffee, and that's only because there's a vast pool of unemployed labor to take advantage of. And probably didn't answer your question very well. Yeah, way in the back.
If everybody stopped using GMOs today, stopped planting them, using them, how long will it take for the genes to recess, or will they at all?
So the question is, if everybody stopped using GMO crops today, how long would it take for them to, get out of the food system?
Yeah, I assume since they're not, a positive, healthy thing, we've got things falling over from.
How long would it take to clean out the genetics? Soybeans, never. It's.
I don't think they go away at all.
Eventually, I mean, it's possible that you dilute it out over a long period of time, but it would be hard to do because it's not only in soybeans, it's crossed other related plants. You can probably, if everybody stopped GMO soybeans for a number of years, I don't know how many years, there's some people that are trying to estimate this, how long would it take to get out of the storage, transportation, distribution system, so say the Europeans might buy it again. People are looking at that, and the answer is multiple years, many years. But I don't have an explicit example, and it's going to be different for different crops. I mean, hybrid open pollinated corn is going to take a lot longer to clean out than say wheat probably, in a genetic sense. The problem is in the storage and distribution. I mean, there's no way to segregate these crops. I mean, think about in Montana, the grain elevators and the rail system and all this stuff that sort of starts in the Dakotas and comes through Montana and ends up in Portland, Oregon, and ships wheat to Japan. There's no way to segregate one genetically modified hard red spring wheat from ungenetically modified wheat. They will contaminate in the distribution system, and that would take years to clean out. The question was, does North Dakota have a lot of GMO crop plants? Yeah, canola. The extent that Montana and the Dakotas have, most of the canola is produced in Canada. That's for oil. But there is some in the Dakotas and Montana. Wheat would be the big one, and wheat has not been introduced commercially yet. That's the big debate in both the Dakotas, Montana in particular, because the varieties of wheat that Monsanto is genetically modifying to make Roundup resistant is hard red spring wheat. That's the kind that the principal variety is grown in Montana and the Dakotas. And they're in field trials. I mean, we're in about the third season of trials. There's something like 28 test plots in Montana that I know about. There's an equal number in the Dakotas. So it's not commercial yet, but it's out there. And Monsanto has applied for the permits or for the certification of the variety. It's really not a regulatory approval, it's just a variety approval that probably 2004, not next season, probably the season after, they will be allowed to have it commercial. Yeah.
Do you have just a rough estimate of what percentage of commercial crops in the U.S. are using currently recognized GMO material?
The question was, what percentage of U.S. crops are using genetically modified, I guess. Of the crops that have been genetically modified, yeah, it's about 2/3 of soybeans, maybe 25 or 30% of corn, something similar for cotton, 25 or 30% of cotton, probably something close to that for canola, and that's pretty much it. I mean, those are the commercial varieties, and most of it is engineered. There's basically only two commercial bits of genetic engineering out there. One is herbicide resistant, which is primarily Roundup tolerant crops. There were some other ones that were done that another company did for their own herbicide, but Monsanto's by far and away the biggest with Roundup Ready. And then the other is what are called BT crops, Bacillus thuringiensis. They've been engineered with this protein that kills caterpillars, and that's principally cotton and corn. And that's it. And most of the rest of the crops have not yet. They're working on them, but wheat will be the next. Wheat is a really crucial one for Monsanto because they're actually in pretty serious financial difficulty. And wheat is the largest acreage crop, probably. If you're a herbicide salesman, that's where you want to be in a global sense. But the resistance to engineering wheat is going to be greater than anything other crop probably, because wheat is the first one anybody's done that's directly consumed by people on a large scale. Soybeans and corn are primarily livestock feed in this country. So we don't eat it directly. We eat it processed or after it's been through a cow or a pig or something. But wheat will be the first crop that we directly consume, and it will be introduced to market with no safety testing whatsoever at all. I mean, it's not the Roundup Ready varieties are not classified as a pesticide, so they don't have any requirements for safety testing. The Food and Drug Administration and USDA have just sort of ruled by fiat that these are the same as conventional varieties and don't require testing. The BT varieties are regulated by EPA as pesticides, and they've had some testing, particularly for allergens. But Roundup Ready wheat will be introduced with no publicly available safety testing whatsoever at all.
So how do you address that issue of the hard science getting out there? It seems like the juggernauts like Monsanto are controlling that, and the information gets out there. There are the little guys, the microbiologists, finding out the information that you're presenting to us. It just seems so almost like a brick wall that you're running into as far as really getting the stuff out there.
The question was for people concerned about this. It must be like running into a brick wall. How do you get these concerns out there when the science and I suppose the politics are controlled by the companies that are doing this work? And in the United States, it's very hard because the corporations, ultimately, you've got to get the corporate influence out of our government. You've got to take their money out of our politics and get the likes of Ann Veneman out of high office if you're going to make a difference in the U.S. But in most of the rest of the world is resisting this much more mightily than in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. is kind of a latecomer to the protest over this. I mean, the Europeans didn't put a moratorium on importing GMO crops because of great scientific studies, or there were quite a few, but it's basically public pressure. I mean, it was politics that kept it out, and that's growing in the U.S. I mean, this whole meeting in Sacramento's got immense protests going on. It's what a lot of the protests and globalization protests are about, are over food and agriculture policy, and it's starting to make an impact in the U.S. But it's, you're right, to run into the integration of government policy and corporate interest is really hard to make a dent in it. Yeah, way in the back here. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There are people in Missoula who are hungry.
The question is, there are people in Missoula who are hungry, and that's true. And there's people, the United, 9%, I think, according to the UN, 9% of the 840 million people, hungry people in the world, actually live in developed, rich countries. And the issue of why people are hungry in Missoula and why people are hungry in Malawi are the same, because they don't have any money. And you don't make enough money to function in the economic setting where you are. You don't have enough money on a minimum wage in Montana to buy food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. So typically what happens is you're surviving on the thin edge and something tips you over. You get sick, or your kid gets sick, or your car breaks down or whatever, and there's not enough money to go around, and food is one of the first things to go, or certainly a balanced diet goes first and then calories go second. And that problem, that's I say that this is a universal problem of poverty and has nothing to do with the supply of food. And it's the same issue in Missoula as it is in some poor country in Africa.
And it's not, people who are hungry in Missoula, for example, it's not their fault. It's easy to blame them, but it's not their fault. It's not their fault.
Yeah, and the comment was that if you're hungry in Missoula, it's not necessarily your fault, and that's true. It's poverty is not something that people experience by choice, and it's imposed for whatever reason by unemployment or circumstance. And, you know, this is a bad economy. And rural, you know, Montana is one of the poorest states in the union because we're basically a producer of unprocessed agricultural and mineral and timber like not much different in the global economic system than Zambia or Zaire or something. So it's the same forces are creating poverty here, and we've got a bit certainly farther to fall than the poor countries, but it's essentially the same forces that you know. There was an article or a commentary in the paper Missoulian yesterday morning about what the minimum wage is and why it should be increased. And the minimum wage in the United States now is effectively less than it was in 1954, according to this article. So, you know, that's a consequence of the free market that we're all supposed to be following, and it's not working. Let me see if I can paraphrase that. I mean, the second part of it is if you're poor and hungry, you know, how do you afford anything but the cheapest food at you know, non-sustainably produced food, I guess. And I'm trying to grapple with how to paraphrase the first part of your question. Yeah, what can consumers do, I guess, is the paraphrase here, and a lot. Yeah, one is putting pressure on our politicians. One of the single most powerful people in the world on issues of globalization and trade is Senator Max Baucus, and he lives in a state where there's less than 500,000 registered voters. Talk to the guy, you know. Talk to his aides. I mean, he's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee where a lot of this stuff is decided. The other thing is go to the farmer's market. Yeah, I mean, there's the political action, and then there's economic action. And, you know, Missoula has one of the more wonderful farmers markets than I've been to, with the exception of a few of them in Mexico. But, you know, and you can actually buy a pretty balanced diet there pretty cheaply if you work at it. And that keeps money in the local economy, and that's where it's going to do some good. Ultimately, and I'm not an economist, obviously, but I marvel at how we think that we're going to have trade and with other countries or even an economic system that grows when we leave out the majority of the people. You know, Mexicans aren't going to make very good trade partners when NAFTA's impoverished half the population. You know, if you're going to have trade, people got to have money to buy stuff with, and the system isn't functioning to do that. I mean, you know, that's one of the things about the debates about a living wage. You know, if people in Missoula made $9 an hour, they could go to the store and buy local stuff instead of from the super Walmart. I mean, you know, so these things are connected, and you know, the thing that we could do for Montana's agricultural economy is instead of genetically modifying wheat and focusing on trying to shave a nickel off of production cost, we need to focus on markets. You know, Montana needs some fair trade. We don't need to be selling wheat to Cargill, who then sells it to South Korea or something. We need to have, you know, Montana Big Sky pure as the driven snow wheat that's sold directly as a fair trade product to Japan and let them pay us $4 a bushel for it, because they're paying for it now from Cargill. Why not pay for it to a cooperative of Montana farmers? I mean, there's a number of levels that you can do, but they all have to do with keeping money and economic activity local rather than sending it out, particularly for places like Montana or poor countries who live primarily on extractive industries or agriculture. You've got to find some way to create value in the local economy, and that can happen all kinds of ways, but it's a local thing. It's, Walmart's not going to save us. It's the right ag commissioner in the state is going to do more for us than Walmart. So, these are, they're not short-term answers. And you're right. If you're hungry and you got, $10 to buy food, you can probably get more food at Walmart than you can at the good food store. But that's not the ultimate answer to why you don't have any money. You had a question in the middle back there.
Getting back to Enron and water, in India, I understand that Enron has been confiscating the water right and left and trying to sell it to the population. And according to a talk by one of the speakers on alternative radio recently, over 100 people in one area have committed suicide rather than die of thirst. And when Enron investors lost so much by the corruption of the company, I felt sorry for them, but I don't feel sorry for them anymore. Why don't investors take more interest in what the company that they're putting their money in is doing?
Absolutely.
A lot of these abuses, if they would take enough interest and care enough about people to know what the company that they're supporting is doing.
The question was about investors in companies, knowing what their companies that they invest in are doing, and Enron in controlling or buying up privatized water in India was your example. Yeah, I mean that's a whole nother dimension that I even talk about. There is quite a few organizations who, ranging that are sort of socially responsible investing, that mutual funds and things that will screen companies based on environmental and social criteria for investment. But that needs to grow. One of the things I've talked to some people who invest church pension funds. I mean, the Catholic Church, the Methodist people have their pension funds are very large blocks of money, and rather than just turn it over to some investor, they're starting to get serious about where they put this money and how they pick the companies. And there's people working on this, and I don't off the top of my head have the addresses to put you in contact with them, but I do at home, and it's probably a movement that's growing just about as fast as fair trade is socially responsible investing, finding out what the company's doing and where you put your money, and efforts to get at large blocks of investment capital to have an effect on that, or on one extreme, or there's other organizations that specialize in buying 100 shares of stock and going to shareholders meetings and carrying on some of these conversations as well. And so there's a number of ways that this is, and organizations doing this, and it's something that's got to grow, and it works. I mean, that's all.
I had a quick question. Recently, I was reading a New Yorker article that was talking about the slow food movement and then how ultimately it was becoming a political party as well. And it sort of made me wonder at the time if that wasn't the solution in the United States. But it seems like in Europe there's such a multi-party environment where you have the Green Party and then also having
question was about the slow food movement in Europe, particularly as a political force, and whether multiplicity of political forces and parties in this country would help some of these issues like in Europe. And starting with the last piece first, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's, you know, we have a system, particularly with relating to food and trade policy, that's basically Republicrat. I mean, there's no functioning difference between the Clinton administration and the Bush administration in the promotion of, you know, quote unquote free trade and genetically modified crops. I mean, the Bush administration's been a bit more pushy about it, but not much. So we do need some alternative political voices here, whether that's third parties or whether that's some reform within one or the other of the political parties. Yeah. The slow food movement is a pretty interesting phenomenon because one of the, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of a movement, I think it started in Italy primarily, where food is, it's a movement to basically slow down and enjoy food as a cultural experience rather than the consumption of calories, I guess. And Europe has sort of been ahead of us. So most of the world is actually ahead of the U.S. or the U.S. has modernized itself to the point where we've sort of lost the connection between food and culture to a large extent. And the slow food movement has been a way to try to recapture that with a variety of I didn't know in terms of political party, but in terms of policy and just social events. And there are some slow food chapters in the U.S. now, and it maybe a person. I did a lot of work in California. I spent a lot of time driving around in California working in agriculture, and I was talking to a colleague of mine who spent a lot of time running around in rent-a-cars like I was doing, and he said that he read something that just really fried him, that 1/3 of all meals in California are consumed in an automobile. And so somewhere, you know, that to me was the sort of ultimate expression that we've lost some connection between our food system and as a cultural as well as and most of the world still has that. I mean, you know, even in really poor places, you know, you go to a public market in Mexico or market day in Mali or somewhere where I've been, and it's an amazing thing. It's like the farmer's market in Missoula. You know, that's a cultural thing as well as a place to buy food. I mean, I had a really difficult time getting through the farmer's market in an hour and a half or 2 hours in the morning because you talk to everybody. And that's what a lot of the rest of the world, even in very poor countries, still has, and what we've lost with Super Walmart. And we need to, you know, that's what the slow food movement is to get that back. What a lot of just buy local campaigns are about to get that back is you know, slow down and fix dinner, you know, and then sit down and eat it together.
Need some food in my belly, need some drink for the dry in my throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Don't you know it ain't right for people to go hungry with all the food being thrown away just because it ain't the right size or perfect, cause you can't turn a fast dollar that way. You know it ain't right to make people grow coffee when their families could be growing food, working those lands for corporations. Don't do hungry people no good, cause people need food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. People got to have food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Don't you know it ain't right those burgers aren't fit to eat. And you know it ain't right to punish the farmers for growing food clean and poison free. There ought to be a government who protects them, protects dollars where they need to be. 'Cause people need food in their belly, they need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. People got to have food in their belly, they need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. But you know we spend 25 million on a movie, not even worth being shown on TV. We spent $2 billion on an airplane that we claim nobody else can see. Then we spent 800 billion on defensive, planning new ways to blow each other around. But even 1% of that budget could stop a whole lot of hungry sound. People need food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, they need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Got to have food in their belly, need some drink for the dry in their throat, need for the world to recognize it. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Everybody's in the same holy boat. Kinda makes me wonder if we're gonna stay afloat.
It was